Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for our second webinar, We All Live in a Watershed. This webinar will be recorded, and we'll have a copy of it available on Facebook as well as on our website. If you have a question at any time, you can go ahead and raise your hand, or you can also submit the question in the chat box. We're doing an interesting sort of hybrid webinar today. Well, a portion of it is going to be a presentation, and then the other portion is going to be a live demo. So if you have questions at any point, let us know, and you can go ahead and ask them live and we can address those. So this is going to be a fun interactive webinar for us today. We're going to start by learning a little bit about our watersheds and why they're so important and what kind of pollution could be affecting them. And then we'll be able to look a little bit at one of the models that we use to talk about watershed health, the EnviroScape model, how you can use it, and how I'll be using it today to show you what we can be doing to prevent pollution. So what is a watershed? A watershed, quite simply, is any area of land that drains to a specific location, like a stream, a lake, a river, or a bay, or any other body of water. It's bounded by mountains along the sides. So you can see here right along at the top of our picture, our watershed is bounded by some mountains, and the water goes down the mountains into the water. To figure out where a watershed boundary is, you can kind of imagine it like your fist. If you have your fist up, where your knuckles are is that ridge of the watershed, and you can imagine if a drop of water falls on one side, it'll go to your wrist, and if it falls on the other side, it'll go towards your fingers. And that's how we have boundaries to those watersheds. Watersheds can come in a lot of different shapes and sizes, and you're actually often in more than one watershed at once. So if you're standing next to an itty-bitty tiny creek, you're likely in that itty-bitty tiny creek's watershed. But that creek flows somewhere, and if it flows to a bigger river, that means that the rainwater that falls in the area that you're in also falls and goes to that bigger river. And then it goes to a bay, and then it goes to an ocean, and then it keeps going. So you're usually in multiple watersheds at once. I'm currently at the Northern Virginia Soil and Water Conservation District offices in Fairfax County, in Fairfax, at the Harity Building, across the street from the Government Center, and we have a little pond outside of our window that is actually the headwaters, or the beginning of where the Difficult Run watershed is. So we are in the Difficult Run watershed. But you, anywhere else in the county, could be in a number of different watersheds. In Fairfax County, some of our largest watersheds are the Cameron Run watershed, the Acatane Creek watershed, Difficult Run, Horsepen Run, and then they could get even smaller, as if you have a small stream in your backyard. But almost all of our water flows to either the Potomac River to the north and the east, or the Occoquan Reservoir to the south. From there it flows to the Chesapeake Bay, and then from there it flows to the Atlantic Ocean. So we are in many watersheds right now, which means that what we do is important on many levels here. We could have an issue with pollution when it comes to runoff. So as we've seen during the very, very rainy time that we had last July, or any of the big storms that we have in the spring, that every time it rains, the water has to go somewhere. Ideally, we would like the water to go into the soil where it infiltrates, it makes its way into the groundwater, it percolates and moves down naturally, and then it becomes part of a larger reservoir of water and makes its way, while it's being cleaned, to other bodies of water. But what often happens is that you get runoff, and if the water can't run in, it runs off. So you get large amounts of water that rain all at once, and they can't actually make their way into the ground, and so they run over it. And that runoff is usually so strong and so powerful that it can carry a lot of contaminants with it. That could be a big issue for our watershed. One of the ways that this runoff can enter some of our water is through storm drains. So I'm sure that all of you have seen storm drains before, and often when I ask someone, where does the water in a storm drain go? They tell me that it goes to a water treatment facility, but it actually doesn't. Unlike the water that goes down any of the drains in our home, which does get cleaned up and processed, the water that goes into a storm drain goes directly into nearby streams and rivers. So if it picks up any runoff that has anything it might be carrying, like chemicals, trash, yard waste, any of the kinds of things that are mentioned here, that's actually going to go straight into the stream as well. If you just have one or two storm drains, you can imagine that's a smaller issue, but Fairfax County has a lot of storm drains. It has thousands and thousands of storm drains, about 80,000 storm drains in total. This is another problem with pollution into storm drains. So you can see that if it's a large pollutant, like a plastic cup or a paper bag, it could get lodged there in the storm drain. It could get stuck, it could stop water from entering, and it could flood our streets. That could be another problem that we experience. And then here's an extreme example of that, where the yard waste and the trash has really built up and made it very difficult for water to enter this storm drain any longer. And here's a really good overview of the stormwater runoff system and essentially how any water that enters as rain is going to go through down to our water bodies. So they'll run off anything they can't go through, like our roofs, gutters, roads, cars, anything solid, our sidewalks, and then from there they'll get carried down into storm drains where they enter the stream. And then they go in through the inlets and through the storm drain system and through the storm drain outlets. If you're interested in seeing where your local storm drains are, if you Google Fairfax County GIS, they have several different applications that you can use to figure out where your local storm drains are. And you can even trace the path of where those storm drains go and how they get to your nearest body of water. So if you wanted to see that again, you can just Google Fairfax County GIS and you'll be able to find it. It's going to be the top link. There we are. So this is what a storm drain outfall looks like, or where all the water ends up. Now it probably didn't look that way when it went into the storm drain, but as you can imagine, along the way it picks up a lot of that gook and it ends up here. So this person is actually trying to remove some waste out of there, some solid waste, some trash and litter it looks like, and her efforts are much appreciated, so that way we stop them here and they don't continue to go down the stream. This is another thing that we can do to try and stop some of the waste that comes out of storm drains from entering our streams. You can see that there's a lot of little bags that are hooked up here, and these mesh bags can expand and they hold quite a large amount of waste. But one of the challenges there is that someone still has to clean those bags out or remove them, and there's a lot of maintenance costs that are involved. So that's not done in every outfall, but you definitely will see those, including in Fairfax County. So how does urbanization affect runoff? Does it really matter if you live in a rural area or in an urban area when it comes to runoff? And it turns out that it really does matter. So in the upper left corner, you'll see natural ground cover. You'll see natural ground cover in places like state parks, county parks. You'll see them in some more forested areas. If you're near a stream, some of that would count as natural ground cover. And naturally, when it rains there is still going to be a little bit of runoff. Even if you don't have any cars, even if you don't have any roads, you're still going to have things that water can't go through, like rocks, or maybe a tree has fallen down and that's blocking the water from getting inside. And when you have a really, really strong rainstorm, it's just going to be too much water for the ground to take in at that time. So there is going to be a little bit of runoff even in natural ground cover. But you can see about half of it infiltrates between shallow infiltration, where it's going to be used by the plant roots, and about half to the deep infiltration, where it's going to go then to a water reservoir. And then some of it evaporates again. And then for the extreme opposite, if you look down to 75% to 100% impervious surface on the bottom right, you'll see there that there's just not a lot of surfaces for the water to actually go into. So when you're looking at 75 to 100% impervious surface, you're looking at some major cities like DC or areas very close to major cities like Ballston. Those areas have a lot of people, so they have to have homes for a lot of people, businesses for a lot of people, transportation for a lot of people, and not so many green areas. And then when you look at the 10 to 20% impervious surface and the 35 to 50% impervious surface on the upper right and bottom left respectively, you'll see that those infiltration rates keep getting lower and lower and lower the closer that you get to 100%. So ideally what we want to do is get all of our rainwater into the ground. We know we won't get 100%, but we want to get as much in as we can. And that's going to be looking more like a natural ground cover. So right now, a lot of Fairfax County is in between that 35 to 50 and that 75 to 100% impervious surface, depending on if you're a little closer to Loudoun or if you're a little closer to DC, that might change up a little bit. But we do have quite a lot of impervious surfaces. So trying to improve that infiltration rate would really help us. So here we get to talk about what are the biggest types of pollution. So far, if you've had any questions about any of the runoff topics that we talked about or our storm drains, go ahead and put those in the chat box and let me know. So what are the biggest types of pollution? There are two main types of pollution. The first is called point source pollution. The second is called non-point source pollution. And I like these names because they're pretty good at figuring out what's what. When you talk about point source pollution, you're looking at any kind of pollution that you can point to the source of. So here in this image, we have a factory, and I don't know what that factory is producing, but it's something gross and green, and it's coming out those pipes. So that is a point source pollutant. We can say this factory made this waste. You can also find point source pollution in outfalls that we saw from storm drains. If you can see the pollution coming there, that would be a point source pollution. Water treatment facilities that may have effluent or excess water that leaves, that could be considered point source pollution. If you can point to it and say that's where it came from, it's point source pollution. What's really important about point source pollution is that point source pollution is the easiest kind of pollution to regulate. If you have a factory that's producing waste and our legislation says that they can only produce a certain amount and they're exceeding it, or they can't produce any and they are, it's very easy to come to them and give them fines or to ask them to clean up the waste because they can't say, no, that wasn't me. We know it was you. And so we can get them to clean that up. In in non-point source pollution, you can't point to where the waste comes from. And this type of pollution is much harder to manage because it's really an issue that everyone contributes to. So managing the actions of one factory is much easier than managing the actions of hundreds of people, but we all do our best. So sources of non-point source pollution is anything that you can't tell where it came from. So anything that would happen on a city street, so maybe somebody drops a cigarette butt and then that makes its way in there. Anything that happens on a suburban development, somebody doesn't clean up after their dog, that makes it there. Anything that happens on a farm, we have too much fertilizer put on the crops, for example, and that makes it into the water. That's another type of non-point source pollution. So here's a nice picture that just shows all those point and non-point sources together and how they're all going to go into the same stream. So this is important to think about because we do have all these different types of pollutions in Fairfax County. So we do have wastewater treatment facilities, we do have factories, we have giant data centers, we have a lot of suburban areas and urban streets. We have, especially towards the south of our county, some rural homes. A lot of people have backyard gardens, and although we don't have those really large farms that you think of where the cattle go on for miles, we do have farms in Fairfax County. We have a lot of horse farms in Fairfax County. And so it's important to know that all of these sources are going to come together into all of our lakes and streams, and so it's important to manage those. So what are the most common pollutants? So the most common pollutants that we're going to see, I'm showing you here in this image, but we're going to talk about a little bit more as well, On the far left, nutrients. Nutrients are a pretty big pollutant, especially when you get into more agricultural areas, but we also use a lot of fertilizer and pesticides on our lawns here, so that could contribute to that as well. In the middle picture, we're depicting sediment, and sediment is a large issue, not just on cropland like is seen here, but anywhere where we have a lot of drainage and erosion problems. And then over on the right is an image of trash and litter. And that, as you can imagine, is also a very large issue here. The nutrients we're mostly concerned about are nitrogen and phosphorus. Nitrogen and phosphorus are very important for plants to grow. It's the vitamins they crave and the nutrients they need. But too much of a good thing can be a bad thing. So if you have too much nitrogen and too much phosphorus and the plants can't take it all up, it can lead to some larger issues. Some sources of nitrogen and phosphorus that we might see would be from animal waste, not just adorable cows like these, but that would also include dog waste. And that would also include, I know we've got some really interesting farms here. We've got goat farms, we've got horse farms in Fairfax County. All of those guys and their waste could be an issue. Lawn fertilizer could be a big problem depending on if you're using it right. So we'll talk about that a little bit more, but imagine all of the big, beautiful lawns that you've seen. And of course, everyone at home now is spending a lot of time on their property, making sure that it looks the way they want it to. So that could be a big factor. And then this picture of dish soap here is included because a lot of dish soaps, detergents, cleaners have phosphorus in them. And if you're not disposing of those cleaners appropriately, then they can make it their way into the water as well. And then wastewater treatment. So actually this tool that they have over here, this tank, there's actually a lot of bacteria in there that break down the waste, usually human waste. And there can be a lot of things that happen there that create some of these excess nutrients. They're trying to consume all the nutrients with the bacteria. So I have some pictures here to drive home the sediment issue. Sediment is a big issue, especially in areas where you have a lot of drainage and erosion concerns. So you'll see under most bridges that there's been a lot of erosion. Along stream banks, there's been a lot of erosion. Actually, the stream bank that's in the bottom left picture is not very uncommon to see here in Fairfax County in some of our streams. Since we have so many streets and water can't go into the ground as quickly as we would like, it all flows into the streams all at once, and our streams are just not designed naturally to take in that much water. So it ends up creating a lot of erosion problems. And you can see it's eroding this bank to the point that the fence above it might collapse. This also happens in new construction often, and we know in Fairfax County that we have an awful lot of new construction, seems like all the time, especially if, like me, you take 66 for work. So there's a lot of places where we're doing construction that if we're not managing that sediment appropriately, it can make its way into the streams. I got a great question asking, how do we avoid using dish soap? And I may have misspoken earlier. I don't mean that we shouldn't use dish soap. Dish soap is very important, and it's important for us to use a lot of different soaps right now, especially when we're trying to stay particularly clean for our health. They do make phosphate-free soaps, and the next time you're in the supermarket or at the grocery store, you're trying to get some new soap, which I know is not the easiest thing to get right now. But think about it for the future, that the next time you're making a purchase like this of a laundry detergent or something like that, you can look on the back on the ingredients, and anytime it's got an ingredient that ends in phosphate, it's got phosphorus in it, which is excess nutrients, it's still then okay to use that. Sometimes it becomes a concern when you are washing your car, for example, and you're using a soap that has phosphates in it, and then that soap runs off of the car and down your driveway and into the storm drain. So it's important when you're using soaps outside to clean things or to use things that you're using soaps that are phosphate free, but again, we all do our best. And then the last biggest source of pollution that we have is trash and litter. And that's not very surprising, I think, to many of you. Especially right now, you've probably seen in the news that there have been a lot of reports of increased trash and litter along roadways and along parking lots. And that's largely due to that we don't want to touch things that are considered dirty. And it's really for your own safety that you don't touch anything with your bare hands. But it is also important that we stop trash from entering the streams in the first place by disposing of them appropriately. So I have a couple of pictures for you. We're going to see whether or not they represent a pollution problem. Is this a pollution problem? So you can let me know what you think, or I'll go ahead and I'll give it a guess. Alrighty, so if you haven't guessed yet, this is a pollution problem. So this is actually what happens to streams when it have too many phosphates in it. So these are caused by some of those detergents or some of that animal waste and things like that. And with that frothy stuff that you get in your stream, that's what causes it. There are also some natural foams that occur in streams, but they're normally along the edges and they break apart easily, and they're not this thick white foam that we see here. Is this a pollution problem? This is kind of like the trick one that I throw in here. This is not a pollution problem. This is a healthy stream. You don't see a lot of erosion along the banks. You see a lot of good plant growth. That means the water can infiltrate into the soil and provide water and nutrients to these plants. So that's a healthy stream. Is this one a pollution problem? That one should be very obvious. This is a very big pollution problem. So this pollution problem is soil. So that black fence that's going around the edge is called a silt fence. And a silt fence is required for many, if not all, I believe, construction projects. If you are going to be removing the grass and you're going to have bare soil, you need to be taking adequate precautions to make sure that that soil is not going to be entering our waterways. This fence clearly did not do its job, or I'm not sure what the job of the fence was. There's bare soil on both sides. So this one is a big mess, and it is a pollution problem. Is this a pollution problem? No, this is what a silt fence is supposed to look like. Not only do we not see bare soil, but this fence has no rips or tears, and it's in place, and it's making sure that if there is an erosion problem, it's not going to enter the street here on the left, which could create an issue into the storm drain. This one, is this a pollution problem? Sometimes people tell me that this is a tricky one. So this is actually maybe a pollution problem. We don't actually know what they're spraying, and we don't really know how much of it they're spraying, and we don't really know how long they've been spraying, or if it's going to rain. There's a lot of different factors involved here. And actually, in this next picture, the question is kind of the same. So there's a couple of best practices that we're going to talk about, like not putting fertilizer down before it rains and putting down the appropriate amount and things like that. And we don't really know if either of the people in these pictures are doing that. So that one's really hard to say. This one, yes, is obviously a pollution problem. All of that trash is going to make its way directly into the water, which is about 10 feet away. So that's enough for social distancing, but that's not quite enough for this trash here. This trash looks much better. This trash has got a lid on it to stop it from being carried away by wind or raccoons or anybody else who might be digging in the trash. So that's really good there. And then this is kind of a picture I have at the end that shows a lot of things that could be a pollution problem. The most obvious pollution problem is that there is a man who is pouring waste directly into a storm drain. Please do not pour any kind of waste directly into a storm drain or anywhere that there could be access to a storm drain. This car is also leaking what could be gas or oil, and that's also going to make its way into the storm drain. This woman by the back with her plants has an open bag of, looks like fertilizer that the water is going to carry as runoff. There's a man who's throwing away trash. And then there's a man in the back who's raking his leaves and bagging them. And I'll talk about that a little bit later, but if you actually let your leaves lay, they're actually really good for the environment. So while that's not a pollution problem, we could teach him to do a little better. So how does pollution affect the living things that are in the water? So eutrophication is something that happens when there are too many nutrients in the water, too much of that nitrogen and too much of that phosphorus. So it starts when there is fertilizer spread on the land. They show here a farm, but it also could be you applying too much fertilizer to your lawn, or maybe a golf course who wants to keep their grass really green. That could also have too much fertilizer. And then for some reason, the fertilizer isn't spread appropriately. Maybe there's too much fertilizer, maybe it's right before the rain, and in any case, it gets washed away by the rain and it's carried down into the soil and it's carried into a lake or another nearby body of water. And if you remember from the beginning, I did mention that fertilizer and the fertilizer, the phosphorus, the nitrogen, they're all food for plants, which is good. They go and then they feed the plants that are in the water, but the problem is actually that the algae is also a plant and it eats a ton of that stuff, grows like crazy, and then once it's done eating all the fertilizer and it's covering the lake, all of the plants underneath won't get any sunlight, so they'll be unable to grow. And since those are the guys that produce most of the oxygen that the other organisms like crawfish and other fish and the macroinvertebrates that we all love so much won't be able to survive down there. And so it really just becomes what's called a dead zone. And it's a lot of work to try and fix that environment back up so that it's healthy again. So the best way to prevent that is just to make sure that if you're using any fertilizers or nutrients, that you're applying those appropriately. And this is a real life example of what that would look like. It's just getting completely covered. It's going to be really difficult for the plants to get sunlight soon. And this situation could end poorly for the organisms living there. If you have too much sediment, you'll see similar changes because it really blocks the habitat that all these organisms use. So on the left, you see a picture with a stream and there's a low level of sediment. It's enough to hold all the plants in place. It's enough to have nooks and crannies in the rocks where the little macroinvertebrates or tiny bugs, tiny aquatic bugs can go live in there and hide. And then on the right, there's a similar stream, but it's got way too much sediment. So there's no more habitat for the organisms to live in, and there's no more habitat for the plants to root into. So then that becomes almost a bit of a dead zone as well, and the water is very cloudy and it can get into the gills of fish and other organisms. So most don't tend to enjoy living in those sedimented areas. And then when we have trash and litter in water, that can be a big issue because it can clog the gills of living organisms. It can destroy habitat much in the way that sediment does if it blocks things. A lot of trash and litter that you see is something called floatable, which means that quite literally it floats. It's plastics and things like that. And the things that float can stay at the surface, and they can also block the sun, just like it would if it were the algae, and it can cover the bottom with things that are heavier like cans, just like it would if it were sediment. So it makes it very difficult for wildlife to find food, to find shelter, to gain resources. It can be pretty bad for them. So this is the end of the first part of our presentation, where we're talking a little bit about what a watershed is and where sources of pollution come from. And from here, we're going to transfer into our live segment where we're going to talk a little bit about my EnviroScape model and what we can be doing at home to prevent that pollution. So if anyone has any questions, just go ahead and put them in the chat, or you can go ahead and raise your hand. I'm still checking everybody. And if you have any questions, let me know. So I'm going to go ahead and end the presentation and then switch over. There we go. I hope everybody can see me. Someone let me know if you can, if you don't mind. Yes, I can see you. Good, good. Perfect. My name is Ashley Palmer, and I've been the voice behind this presentation. Probably should have introduced myself at the beginning. But my name is Ashley, and I'm the Conservation Education Specialist for the Northern Virginia Soil and Water Conservation District. And a large part of what I do is to share knowledge, like I just did with you, about how important our watershed is and how important it is to keep it clean and things that we can do, small actions, to prevent pollution. So this is a tool that I use quite often, and if you're watching and you think that you would like to use it too, just let me know, because this tool is available for teachers, scout leaders, other youth group leaders to borrow. And I know that this is not the most convenient time to be planning for our classrooms and our classroom resources, but just like me, I'm sure that you could find a way to do this virtually and share some information about watersheds with your students, with your friends, with the young ones that you're in charge of, or with other adults like I'm sometimes doing today in other presentations. So this is a really cool tool. I hope that you can see it very well. It's called the EnviroScape. And the EnviroScape model is a plastic model that represents a real-life watershed. And it's one that you can change up to match your needs. And I'm going to be using it today to talk a little bit about some of the things that we can do to prevent pollution. I'm going to do kind of a little bit of a hybrid. I'm going to use the model a little bit to show my points and illustrate those, but I'm also going to be talking a little bit about things that we can do. And then if you have anything to add or other ideas, please add them in the chat. If you raise your hand now, I can't see you because of the view changing, but if you want to say something, let me know. I can open up the mic for you to talk for a little bit, or if you have any questions, let me know. Just go ahead and put that in the chat. So I'm going to start here with the EnviroScape model and what's on it. So we started by talking about what is a watershed. And watersheds, we remember, are anywhere where one big area of land drains to one small body of water or a common body of water. And so you can see by the design of this model with the raised edges that this is one watershed. Any rain that'll go anywhere on this watershed would eventually make it into this little stream where I don't know if you can see him, but there's a little turtle who lives in this stream. And so any of the water is going to make it down to see him. Runoff is definitely going to occur here, and you'll see that when we start to make it rain. You'll see that the water is going to start to move down and it'll be visibly running off, really helping us to imagine where that water is going to go as it follows the valleys down to the water. We also talked a little bit about storm drains. Now, unlike Fairfax County's 80,000 storm drains, this model just has the one storm drain. It's located here at the bottom along the street, where anything water that goes in here would actually make its way into the water, which is very representative of what we see in real life. We also talked a little bit about urbanization. And as you look at different areas of the model, you're going to see some are more urban, some are more rural. Now, one deficit of the model is that it's all plastic. So not everything is going to sink in that we would see in real life. But all of the green spaces are intended to be grass. All the brown spaces are intended to be bare soil. The white spaces are intended to be rocks. And then, of course, we have our roads here. So our roads and our parking lots and our buildings are what we're going to see as mostly going to be those places where it's running off. And then we also talked a little bit about point and non-point source pollution. So where we can point to where the pollution comes from is here at this factory. I'm going to point at it. This factory is going to be making a pollutant, and the pollutant would be able to go down here into this stream. So that's one place that we can see where there's a point source pollution. This is a water treatment facility. It treats water that comes from homes, which includes water which has human waste in it. So this could be a source of bacteria or excess nutrients that might make its way into the water. And then everything else is going to represent non-point source pollution. So over here we have a construction site. If this was really Fairfax County, I'm sure it would be much larger, or it seems like it sometimes. And then we have some homes. This home actually has a chicken, and I don't think you can see it, but this is an adorable little chicken that lives in this home, and it's actually in their backyard. And if you're interested in backyard chickens, our webinar for next week is going to be led by Willie Wood, who is going to be talking to us about backyard chickens, chicken management, how to have your own chickens, chicken regulations. He's going to cover all of it. So if that interests you, joining us next week. We've got a horse farm over here. These guys have a dog in their backyard, a farm. So we have a lot of different places that pollution can come from. So we'll talk a little bit about yard waste and fertilizer and those excess nutrients. And on this model, I really want to show you what those are going to look like. So I have some lovely sprinkles and other food items that I will not be eating. Instead, I'm going to be putting them on the model so we can kind of see some of these pollutants as we talk a little bit about them. So when we talk about fertilizer, some best practices that you can use right now are really important to talk about. I know that while I'm at home, I'm working on my little garden. I'm working in my green spaces and developing a lot of stuff in my yard. And from the crowds I've seen at Lowe's and Home Depot, I think a lot of other people are in the same place. While we're at home, we're actually taking the opportunity to change our homes up a little bit and make them the way that we want. A lot of people are starting to grow their own food at home, which is also great. So some things to think about when you are working in your garden at home are that when you're using fertilizer, use your fertilizer appropriately. That means reading the bag of your fertilizer, and on the back of it, it's got instructions on how to apply it. Make sure that you're following those instructions. So it'll tell you don't apply it before it's going to be raining. Make sure you use a certain amount. Don't use it very close to water sources and things like that. And those are all really important to follow just to make sure that it doesn't make it into our streams and rivers. And then if you have any excess fertilizer or anything else that's going to go on your yard and it's a chemical, make sure that you're disposing of that appropriately, either in the trash as recommended or at the hazardous waste station. You can also send it there if it's a hazardous waste chemical. But just make sure that you're not pouring any excess fertilizers or anything like that down the drain. And then another good thing to do when you're thinking about your plants and your fertilizers is a lot of fertilizers also are something called slow release. And what that means is that instead of kind of flooding your plants with those nutrients all at once, they're going to release those for a longer extended time. There's a lot of value in that because if you have those released all at once and then it does happen to rain, it was a beautiful day, you weren't expecting it, and it rains anyway, then it'll carry all those nutrients with it. But if you instead have it slowly releasing over time, it's going to provide more food for the plants as well. So in my model, I have some fertilizer, and I'm going to say that we were fertilizing over here at this home. Well, that's going to be a mess. This is great. And this nice green space is owned by a golf course. So we were fertilizing there as well. And then, of course, over here at the farm. So when you're also outside, some of us are spending our time doing some cleanup, which is really nice, but make sure that you're only cleaning up what you have to. So if you are mowing your lawn or you're raking some of those leaves from last fall, something to think about is that you could just leave them lie. So that would save you a little bit of work, and it would also be really great for the environment. Those extra grass clippings break down and they decompose in place and then provide more nutrients for the grass that's still there. And if you have any leaves, they provide a really great habitat for a lot of different bugs. And if you join me on Tuesday, you'll know that a lot of different bees also live in the leaf litter and debris. It's a great habitat resource for them. So it's important to leave those things lie if you can, and then save yourself a little bit of work. We also know right now that all of our waste collectors are very busy during this time, so giving them a little bit less work to do as well, they probably wouldn't mind. So that's an idea. And if you are working and planting new plants, when you plant new plants, try to choose native plants. If you're thinking, I don't know which plants are native, you can Google Plant Nova Natives, and Plant Nova Natives is a great organization that lists tons of native plants of all different sizes and colors and shapes, and they're all amazing. And what's great about native plants is they usually require less fertilizers. So let's say that these guys decided not to leave their their leaf litter lay, and they bagged it all up, and then the bag was ripped open by their golden retriever. That's what happened here. So another source of waste that we talked about was animal waste. When I do this model with all of my younger viewers, they are in love with the animal waste and what that does to our ecosystem here. So what I'm mostly thinking about is when you are walking down the street, you're taking your dog for a walk on the exercise that you're supposed to be doing, then if your dog goes to the bathroom, clean it up. It's important not to leave any waste anywhere it doesn't belong, because that can also provide excess nutrients. Unfortunately, this homeowner did not clean up after their dog. And actually, even if it's in your own yard, you should still clean it up, because although no one is going to step in it and get mad at you just because it's in your yard, still think your yard is still part of this watershed, so that water going through here is still going to carry it away. These guys over here on the farm, these cows, love to go into the water because it helps them to stay cool. And we can imagine these cows are goats or sheep or horses or any other kinds of farms that we might have in Fairfax County, and they're going to make a little waste as well. We also talked about bare soil being an issue. This is actually cocoa powder, so unfortunately you can't smell it from there, but it's about to smell really good over here in this room. This cocoa powder is going to go any place that there is bare soil, and we'll think about some ways that we can prevent some of that bare soil from being bare in the first place. So over here at this construction site, we've got a lot of bare soil. Unfortunately, we didn't put in any silt fencing here, so there's a lot of erosion there. And there's also some erosion here at the farm. So something that we could do to prevent some of that open erosion, and some that you might be even having on your own property, is if you're having erosion problems, the biggest answer is to take what's causing that erosion, usually water, and make it go into the ground and settle, because that erosion is happening when there's either bare soil already or there's a really high volume of water that's traveling all at once. A really great way of doing that is to plant in those areas. So you can plant in those areas, and then those roots are going to help to hold the soil in place a little bit better. Sometimes we can use those bare areas for something else instead. So if you have a lot of bare areas on your property, or you just kind of have this one spot that no matter how many times you plant grass there, it won't grow, don't we all have one of those? Then you could turn that spot into a garden. So there's a lot of people right now who are choosing to start their own gardens and see how they turn out. Or if you've done it before, you know that it shouldn't take too much work. You can turn a little space into a great garden. And if you're interested in seeing some great gardens or learning more about edible gardens or sustainable gardens, stay tuned for our Sustainable Garden Tour, which is going to be held throughout June. We're going to be showing and showcasing a lot of really beautiful gardens from Fairfax County that have both edibles, native plants, really beautiful, beautiful spaces. So that might give you some inspiration if you haven't already started on your garden. You can also, if you have a bare spot, try to replace the grass there, and just try and make sure that we have something with roots that's going to hold in the water. If you're doing some bigger projects, like someone told me that they were going to put in a patio, if you're going to do something big like that, just start to think about where the water is going to go Maybe you could use porous pavers so that the water is still going to go in. Or maybe then you might want to set up something around it, more native plants and more things like that that's going to take in some more of the water. So we also talked about a third source of pollution, which is trash and litter. Here I get to bring out the rainbow sprinkles. And when we're talking about trash and litter, we can think of so many different sources that might have trash and litter. Even when we try our best, we don't always keep our litter in check. For example, I have seen multiple times at my condo association community that although we let everyone know that if the trash can is full, don't put any more trash in there, a lot of people will still put trash to the sides because they just don't know any better. And then sometimes those can get ripped open and trash can come out, or sometimes raccoons can go through your trash and scatter that trash. And then once it's out, it's probably going to make its way into a stream. So just using some best practices there, always put your trash into a container that has a lid that's sealed, that's protected. Don't have your trash out, for example, on a very windy day where it's going to get knocked over or carried down the street. Dispose properly of the trash that you have. Be a responsible steward of the environment and make sure that every piece of trash you have ends up in a trash can, or if it can be recycled, that it is recycled. Too often we see trash along the side of the roads. So let's just make sure that we're being responsible with all of our waste. So here, I'm just going to put it all along our roads because these guys did not get the message that you just did, and now there's litter everywhere. Something else to think about is that right now we're all staying at home and we're creating a lot of waste. And I'm not going to tell you to change any of your habits now, because right now you should be doing what's safest and healthiest and best for your families. But while you are at home, try and think a little bit about the waste that you're creating. I've started to think about the waste that I'm making. For example, it's really hard to not get takeout in a polystyrene container. And those styrofoam containers cannot be recycled anymore. So every time I get takeout, I think that that's trash that's never going to be reused again. And every time I tell them not to give me plastic utensils, they give me plastic utensils anyway. And I'm using a lot more plastic bags now because at the grocery store they're not taking reusable bags. So I'm not thinking about changing my habits now, but in the future, I and you might want to think about doing things that could prevent extra waste in the future, like using more reusable water bottles instead of single-use plastic ones, using reusable bamboo cutlery instead of plastic ones, instead of plastic bags, using our own reusable bags. There's a lot of reusable alternatives. So take this time not necessarily to make changes, but to become very aware of your environment and what your role is in it. Some other things to think about with trash is that later on, when we are in our new normal, then it would be great to join a cleanup. And then a lot of those cleanups are organized by Clean Fairfax and other similar groups in Fairfax County. So I know friends of Lake Accotink do cleanups. I know friends of or Cub Run Park Volunteer Team do cleanups. There's quite a few. So you can just look at your nearby stream and see if you can organize a cleanup there or join one that already exists. So that although you're preventing trash from entering the stream on your end, you're also helping on the other end to clean up some of the trash that is already there. And let me get to my last category, which is kind of called other. These are the red sprinkles. They're just other. They're other pollutants that didn't really fall into any of my other categories. So that would include oil and gas, which might come from cars, or it might come from machinery and equipment. It might be pesticides that are put down on properties to make sure that we're not getting all those mosquitoes and bugs. And then there's a couple other things that might make its way in there that we really don't want to, such as waste from this factory. So things that we can do while we're here at home to prevent some of those other hazards from entering our water are to do things like check our vehicles. A lot of people are not driving very much anymore, but it's important to still check on your vehicle to make sure that it's still working as expected, and then also to see while it was sitting and we were away, did it leak anything? Because if your vehicle does have an oil leak, for example, or it's got some drips, it could be dripping quite some time before you drive it again. So it's important just to take a look at that and just make sure that it's not dripping onto your driveway or the road, which would then make it into the stream through the storm drains. If you have the chance, try and use some phosphate-free soaps. Again, I know that soap is hard to come by right now, and especially when you find it, you don't really get to be picky. I'm in that boat too. But just kind of keep it in mind for later that that's something that you might want to look into the next time that you're in the market. Don't put fats, oils, or greases down the sink. All of those should go into the trash. When you put those down the sink, they can clog your sink and cause backups. In some places, they make things called fatbergs, where the fats and the grease all come together and they clog up the pipes like a big iceberg, and they have to break into them to open them out. So to prevent mini fatbergs from occurring in your pipes at home and causing some issues, make sure that you're just disposing of those in the trash. And then especially when you think about disposing of other things, most things should be disposed of in the trash and not into the toilet or down the sink. Old medications that you are no longer taking, you can get rid of those in the trash. If there's not an old medication collection near you, and if you have any hazardous waste like paints or nail polish, the I-66 hazardous waste collection is still open as of today, the 21st. So that's another option for getting rid of some of your waste. And when you are flushing, just remember the only things that you should flush are the 3 P's: pee, poo, and toilet paper. So anything else should not be going down the drain, just those 3 P's. So no feminine products, no floss, no hair, no anything else, just the 3 P's go down the drain. When you're using the model, when you get to talk about all the exciting stuff that I just talked about and things that you can do at home, we actually want to see what happens on this model. So this is where I'm really going to drive home what we're doing and why it's important. So I've got some water ready. And I may have to pour it for you to, I'm getting water on my computer. I'm actually just going to pour it so we can see where the water is going to go and where it's going to carry. And for some of these, you're going to see some of the colors moving as well. And you'll notice that even though some people have done everything right, like this house over here, they still are going to be living next to this water that has a lot of waste in it. Because, as the title of this presentation suggests, we all live in a watershed, and we all live together in a watershed. And it's important that we work together to keep our watershed healthy. This was a very big storm. This is reminiscent of that July storm that we had. So we can see on our model here, I hope that you can see it, that some water has stayed in some little puddles, but a lot of it made it down. It smells great, but it looks like a mess. It's a big mess. So this is a really great tool to talk a little bit about our watersheds. So that is about the end of my presentation. If you have any questions or if you would like tips on particular things that you can do to prevent pollution while you're at home during this time, or if you have any questions about your particular fertilizer or anything like that, just let me know and I can answer those. And if anybody wants to talk, just let me know in the chat and I'll unmute you so you can ask your question. I think we're good. So I'm going to go ahead and end our presentation. If you enjoyed this presentation, thanks for coming. And if you'd like to join us next week, Willie Wood is going to be talking about backyard chickens, chicken management, all kinds of good things like that. So next week is going to be a really great topic. And I did get a question, do you make visits to schools? Sometimes I do. Sometimes I do go to schools. Most often, I train teachers on how to use the model so that they can take it and so they can visit extra classes or visit multiple grade levels for extended periods of time and longer days. But I do make visits to schools and scout groups and things like this. This is a really great program for that. Thanks so much for joining us. And if you missed anything or wanted to take notes, then I'll have a copy of this available on Facebook and our website. Thanks again. Have a great day and stay safe.